In the fading light of a once invincible empire, the marble columns of Rome stood silent, their shadows stretching long across forums that had echoed with the commands of emperors for centuries. Yet beneath the grandeur, something was unraveling, not with the thunder of barbarian hordes at first, but with the quiet creak of authority slowly losing its grip. This is the story of the slow erosion of authority, a process that did not announce itself with fanfare or sudden catastrophe, but crept forward like twilight overtaking the day, turning the world's greatest power into a hollow shell. By the time the final cracks appeared, the mechanisms that had held civilization together for half a millennium were already fractured beyond repair, leaving generations to wander through the ruins of what they once believed eternal. The Roman Empire at its zenith commanded respect from the sands of North Africa to the mists of Britannia. Its roads, straight as arrows, carried legions, merchants, and ideas across continents. Aqueducts brought fresh water to teeming cities, while laws inscribed on bronze tablets promised order and justice under the watchful eye of the emperor, the living embodiment of Roman might. Authority flowed from the center like blood through veins, reinforced by legions whose discipline was legendary, and a bureaucracy that collected taxes with relentless efficiency. Citizens and subjects alike lived under the assumption that this system was immutable, a divine order sanctioned by the gods themselves. The Senate debated, the legions marched, and the emperor's word reshaped maps. Yet this immense structure, built on conquest and tradition, contained within it the seeds of its own gradual dissolution, invisible at first to those who benefited most from its stability. Daily life in the empire before the erosion accelerated felt reassuringly familiar, even routine. In bustling marketplaces, vendors hawked olives, wine, and spices under the warm Mediterranean sun, while children played in the streets and philosophers argued in shaded colonnades. Farmers tended fields that had fed Rome for generations, their labor protected by distant legions. In grand villas, patricians hosted feasts where poets recited verses and slaves moved silently with platters of exotic fruits. The rhythm of baths, theaters, and religious festivals provided a sense of continuity, a comforting illusion that the empire's authority was as solid as the stone walls surrounding provincial towns. Sounds of hammering from blacksmiths forging weapons and tools blended with the laughter of crowds at chariot races. Few paused to notice the subtle shifts, the growing weight of taxes, the occasional delay in grain shipments from Africa, or the murmurs of discontent among frontier soldiers facing harsher conditions. Life continued, anchored by habit and the visible symbols of imperial power, statues of emperors, triumphal arches, and the steady tramp of military boots. But no one understood what was coming next when the first invisible warning signs began to emerge from the edges of the empire. Economic pressures mounted quietly as inflation gnawed at the value of currency, with debased coins circulating more frequently. Emperors struggled to maintain the vast network of client states and alliances that had once secured borders without constant warfare. Corruption seeped into provincial administrations, where governors enriched themselves at the expense of local populations, eroding trust in central authority. On the frontiers, barbarian tribes pressed against the lines, not always in open invasion, but through persistent raids and migrations, driven by pressures from further east. The military, once the iron fist of Roman will, began to rely more heavily on foederati, barbarian recruits whose loyalty was conditional. These early fractures were dismissed as temporary setbacks, manageable through traditional Roman pragmatism. Yet they signaled a deeper malaise, the slow detachment of authority from the realities it sought to govern, as decisions made in distant palaces failed to address the lived experiences of soldiers, farmers, and merchants. Rising tension and instability spread like cracks through dry earth during the 3rd century, when the empire faced the crisis of the 3rd century. Rapid successions of emperors, often installed and murdered by their own troops, revealed the fragility of imperial legitimacy. Authority, once revered as sacred, became a prize contested by ambitious generals and opportunistic claimants. Cities suffered from repeated sieges and plagues that decimated populations, disrupting trade and agriculture. The divide between the wealthy elite and the struggling masses widened, fostering resentment that undermined social cohesion. In the countryside, banditry increased as central enforcement weakened, while in the forums, debates turned bitter over religious shifts and philosophical doubts. The empire's vast size, once its strength, now hindered swift responses, creating delays that allowed local powers to assert themselves. People whispered of omens and declining fortunes. Yet official proclamations insisted on continuity. The machinery of state continued to turn, but with increasing friction, as loyalty to the idea of Rome competed with personal survival and regional interests. Key decisions and mistakes compounded the erosion, often made with the best intentions, yet accelerating the decline. Attempts at reform, such as Diocletian's division of the empire into eastern and western halves to improve administration, inadvertently weakened the unified authority that had defined Roman power. Heavy taxation to fund larger armies strained the economy, driving farmers into debt and depopulating rural areas as people fled to seek protection from powerful landowners. Alliances with barbarian groups provided short-term military relief, but introduced cultural and political influences that diluted traditional Roman identity. Emperors like Constantine shifted the capital eastward to Constantinople, prioritizing the more prosperous east and leaving the west increasingly isolated. Religious transformations from pagan pluralism to the dominance of Christianity challenged old hierarchies and created new factions. Each choice, born of pressure and necessity, chipped away at the centralized authority, replacing it with a patchwork of competing influences. By the late 4th century, the Western Empire's emperors often ruled in name only, their commands ignored or manipulated by powerful generals and barbarian kings operating within Roman borders. The moment the system began to fail arrived not in a single dramatic conquest, but through a series of quiet surrenders and symbolic ruptures. In 410 AD, the Visigoths under Alaric sacked Rome itself, a city that had not fallen to a foreign enemy in 800 years. The psychological shock reverberated across the Mediterranean, shattering the myth of invincibility. Authority eroded further as puppet emperors were installed and deposed by barbarian warlords like Odoacer, who in 476 AD deposed the last Western Roman emperor, Romulus Augustulus. No grand battle marked the end. Instead, the slow transfer of real power from imperial institutions to localized strongmen unfolded. Tax collection faltered, legions dissolved or merged with tribal forces, and infrastructure crumbled from neglect. The silence that followed in abandoned forums and overgrown roads spoke volumes. The central voice of authority had grown too faint to command obedience. What remained were fragments of the old order, sustained by memory and inertia, but powerless against the centrifugal forces pulling the empire apart. Human consequences and social breakdown followed swiftly in the wake of this eroded authority. Cities shrank as populations sought safety in fortified hilltop settlements, abandoning the open plains that had once thrived under Roman protection. Trade routes became dangerous, leading to shortages of goods and a return to localized barter economies. Knowledge and skills, preserved in great libraries and academies, began to fade as literacy declined and patronage for scholars dried up. Families fractured under the weight of famine, disease, and displacement, while violence between rival factions became commonplace. The sense of shared Roman identity dissolved into tribal loyalties and regional allegiances. Fear replaced routine. The sounds of daily markets gave way to the uneasy quiet of guarded walls and the distant clash of steel. For ordinary people, farmers, artisans, and former soldiers, the collapse meant not just political change but the loss of predictability, security, and the cultural framework that had defined their lives for generations. Survivors adapted, but the world they inherited was smaller, harsher, and haunted by the ghosts of former glory. The long-term historical impact of this slow erosion reshaped the trajectory of Western civilization in profound ways. The vacuum left by Rome's authority allowed new kingdoms to emerge from the fusion of Roman, Germanic, and Christian elements, laying the foundations for medieval Europe. Feudal systems arose as local lords filled the power gap, offering protection in exchange for service. The preservation of Roman law, language, and administrative traditions in the East and in church institutions provided continuity amid the chaos, influencing later revivals like the Carolingian Renaissance. Yet the fragmentation also led to centuries of instability, where knowledge was lost and technological progress slowed in many regions. This period, often called the Dark Ages, was less a total blackout than a reconfiguration, where authority became decentralized, personal, and tied to land and faith rather than a distant emperor. The echoes of Rome's fall influenced everything from the Holy Roman Empire's claims to legitimacy to modern concepts of governance and the rule of law. Even today, the ruins stand as silent witnesses, their weathered stones whispering of a time when authority seemed eternal, yet proved vulnerable to gradual decay. The slow erosion did not begin with invading armies or cataclysmic disasters. It began with complacency, with small compromises, with the failure to adapt ancient structures to new realities. In those quiet shifts, the foundations weakened until the entire edifice could no longer stand. As we look upon our own institutions and the fragile threads of trust that bind societies together, the story of Rome serves as a haunting reminder. Authority, once lost through erosion, is not easily restored. The collapse did not end history, it transformed it, leaving a legacy of both loss and renewal that continues to shape the world we inhabit. In the end, the greatest empires fall not from a single blow, but from the accumulated weight of unheeded warnings and the imperceptible drift away from the principles that once sustained them.